One.
Good afternoon, good morning, good evening from wherever you're calling. My name is Don Kanak. I'm chairman of Prudential Insurance Growth Markets. It's my privilege as chairman of the EU-ASEAN Business Council and as chairman of the ASEAN Hub, a co-chairman of the ASEAN Hub of the Sustainable Development Investment Partnership, the SDIP, to welcome all participants to today's program. The Business Council, the SDIP, and the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance, all three of which Prudential is a member, are collaborating this year on an emerging markets transition investment initiative. The goal of the initiative is to bridge perspectives on net zero between developed and developing markets, and to help identify practical solutions that can advance better climate outcomes in developing countries, but without sacrificing the achievement of other sustainable development goals. Developing countries are key to global decarbonization efforts. Between 2020 and 2030, 90% of middle-class growth will be in Asia Pacific. 98% of population growth will be in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. But today, most green or sustainable finance is in Europe, North America, and North Asia. Less than 10% of sustainable debt issuance in 2020 was in developing markets, excluding China, and only 10% of around 3,500 signatories of the UN Principles of Responsible Investment are active in such markets. Sustainable economic development and a just transition depend on the capacity of developing countries to simultaneously grow and green. And for that, they'll need investment. Southeast Asia is among the world's most vulnerable regions to climate change, and yet still has a high reliance on coal and fossil fuels that must be reduced. Recent events in Europe are highlighting, however, that even for advanced economies, managing emissions while providing energy security and affordability is not simple. How can Asia's developing economies reduce dependence on coal and other fossil fuels while still providing accessible, affordable, and secure electricity to millions of citizens who currently lack such access? Are financing resilience, important social objectives, and climate transition at the same time, are those competing challenges, or are they mutually supportive? How should developed countries assist in this transition, particularly in light of the fact that most historical greenhouse gases were emitted by the developed world? Today's webinar aims to explore those questions and to shed light on the ways forward. First, we are honored to hear from Dr. Aung Poonmanorath, Deputy Prime Minister for Economy and Finance and Minister for Economy and Finance of the Royal Government of Cambodia. As you know, this year Cambodia is chair of ASEAN, and last Thursday and Friday, Dr. Poonmanorath chaired the annual meeting of ASEAN finance ministers and central bank governors, where sustainable finance was a topic of considerable discussion. Following Dr. Poonmanorath's remarks, Sean Kidney, co-founder and CEO of the Climate Bonds Initiative, will moderate an outstanding panel of leaders representing different perspectives on financing net zero carbon in emerging markets. We're hopeful that today's events will better inform those of you in developed markets about the unique challenges facing developing countries. And we also hope that this event will encourage more stakeholders in emerging and developing economies to get involved in net zero initiatives. Institutional investors and other asset owners who wish to learn more about the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance or to explore becoming members, please see the chat for information. Others in private sector or public sector or civil society that like to learn more about the EU-ASEAN Business Council or SDIP, please see links provided in the chat. During the panel discussion, I encourage the audience to ask questions, but please use the Q&A function to pose your questions, not the chat function. Thank you very much. And now we turn to the remarks of His Excellency Dr. Aung Poonmanorath, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Economy and Finance of the Royal Government of Cambodia.
Mr. Donald Kanak, Chairman of EU-ASEAN's Business Councils and co-chair of the ASEAN Hub of the Sustainable Development Investment Partnership. Mr. Ju Oakley, Head Regional Agenda, Asia Pacific for World Economic Forums. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. First, I would like to convey my apologies to Mr. Donald Kanak, Chairman of the EU-ASEAN Business Councils, and other fellow leaders that I'm not able to attend this virtual event in real time. Nonetheless, I'm very delighted to be able to share my pre-recorded remarks with the panelists in addressing the challenges and needs for sustainable financing. The Royal Government of Cambodia has recognized that increasing vulnerabilities of climate change as well as other natural disasters could drastically undermine national progress in achieving inclusive and sustainable development, especially in the emerging economies where decarbonization efforts and financing availability are limited compared to the advanced economies. However, it is crucial for each country, regardless of their development stage, to take concerted actions now to address these challenges by channeling investment flows to support the sustainable development, energy transitions, as well as efforts towards net zero carbon in emerging markets. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, many emerging and developing countries are facing limited fiscal space and resources, resulted from huge expansionary fiscal policy implemented in the fight against COVID-19 to effectively implement their sustainable development policy measures. In addition, the COVID-19 pandemic has also significantly set back or even reversed hard-earned progress toward sustainable development goals and adversely impact all aspects of financing for development. In particular, the financing needs for sustainable development could be overwhelming in low-income and developing economies, especially to achieve decarbonizations of their economic developments. Therefore, investing in sustainable and resilient development might not be feasible for them without close collaborations with developed countries, especially through long-term support and sustainable finance strategies. Currently, emerging markets account for an increasingly large share of global emissions, now 65%, including China. To achieve the net zero targets, collaborations between emerging and developed economies is required. These collaborations would need to cover extensive areas such as technology transfer in reductions of industrial carbon emissions, reforestation initiative, and EV adoption. In addition, the emerging markets also need to closely work with the international community in setting practical targets, but with some flexibility, like abatement methods, which can allow emerging markets to achieve desirable outcomes with minimum economic cost. Furthermore, the international community and developed economies can also serve as facilitator to the carbon credit trading, which can be an effective source of financing to green investments for emerging markets, as there is massive green financing shortfall for emerging markets to meet their investment needs. Bearing in mind the financing limitation for the case of Cambodia, in implementing the climate change mitigations and adaptations, we are also facing the issue of, first, lack of coordinations amongst relevant stakeholders. Second, inadequate technology developments and transfers from developed economies. And third, limited institutional capacity and awareness. In a similar vein, to achieve climate's ambitions to reach net zero by mid-century, developing economies must revamp energy systems and mobilize additional support across multiple stakeholders, regionally and globally, thereby raising a set of complex and interrelated challenges and specific needs to be addressed as follows. 1. Adopting development models that can accommodate different priorities. Developing countries are challenged with finding development models that can keep up with rapid demand growth while expanding access to underserved communities such as energy security, quality transport services, water, food security, and prioritizing environmental sustainability amidst fiscal pressures amplified by COVID-19. 2. Financing shortfalls. The shift toward green, inclusive, human-centric energy will imply more capital intensity in affordable clean energy supplies and enabling infrastructures that have high upfront investment requirements and are significantly more expensive relative to that in advanced economies. Therefore, it is imperative to develop sustainable financing systems and mobilize private commitments for bridging the financing gaps and reallocating capital toward clean energy in developing economies. 3. Labor market challenges. Developing economies also undergo marked regional socioeconomic disparities in job creations in the energy sectors, especially amongst marginalized communities, as countries seek to advance their net zero targets. Upskilling and reskilling human resources to prepare for future labor markets in clean energy are crucial to enable citizens to reap full benefits from newly emerging opportunities and to navigate possible disruptions caused by energy transitions, especially in high-emission sectors. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, as we are navigating the exits of the prolonged COVID-19 amid the rapid progress of technological revolutions and digital transformations, strengthening resilience for development is one key priority for the Royal Government of Cambodia, as stated clearly in the Pillar 3, Resilience, of our strategic frameworks and program for economic recovery in the context of living with the COVID-19 in new normals 2021-2023. Through this strategic frameworks documents, the Royal Government of Cambodia is committed to addressing medium and long-term challenges, especially by mobilizing efforts on, but not limited to, 1. Continuing to accelerate the adoptions of digital transformations. 2. Strengthening the capability to adapt to climate change. And 3. Prioritizing green and sustainable developments which are aligned with the SDGs, yet demanding huge support from both regional and international partners. Meanwhile, I wish to inform the panel that as the chair of the ASEAN Summit that will take place in the upcoming months of this year, Cambodia will promote and harmonize efforts to accomplish our important task, especially in expediting the equitable, resilience, and sustainable post-COVID-19 recovery reflected in our broad themes, ASEAN Act, addressing challenges together, as well as ASEAN's finance cooperation's priorities, namely recovery, resiliency, and togetherness. In this regard, I would like to emphasize our commitment to the promotions of green developments and attracting green investment, which are key pathway to help cope with environmental and socioeconomic challenges, as well as to build resiliency for sustainable recovery. As chair of ASEAN Finance Ministers for 2022, Cambodia has placed high priority on initiatives such as the ASEAN Catalytic Green Finance Facilities, ACGF, for accelerating green infrastructure investments in the regions. On top of this, we will accelerate developments of digital infrastructure to maximize the benefits from the rapidly growing digital transformations through pushing the implementations of initiatives related to ASEAN Digital Master Plan 2025, ASEAN E-Commerce Agreement, and Pandaseri Bengawan Roadmap on ASEAN Digital Transformations Agenda. To conclude, on behalf of the Royal Government of Cambodia, I would like to reiterate the importance of international support and cooperation in tackling environmental issues and ensuring sustainable economic growth during the post-COVID-19 periods. Hence, Cambodia would like to urge all developed countries to deliver their promises, both in terms of financial assistance and technological transfers, to support developing countries in adapting to the impacts of climate change and building resilience. Finally, I wish the panels a fruitful discussions which will provide meaningful contributions to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pornoriv, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance and Economy of Cambodia, for your useful and important introductory remarks. Folks, I'm Sean Kidney, the CEO of the Climate Bonds Initiative. I'm the moderator for today, and we're about to see a wonderful panel joining us to talk about this particular topic. Hopefully Don will stay on and, subject to his travel arrangements, be able to say a few words at the end. We're still waiting for Pak Wemby to come in from Indonesia at the moment. He's been caught up in another matter. So we're going to get going with our other panelists. We're lucky enough to have with us Mrs. Rita Arora, who's the CEO and CIO, Chief Investment Officer of Asia for Allianz. As we all know, the Chief Investment Officer is far more important than the Chief Executive Officer role, but she has both in this case, which is extraordinary. We have Pak Rinaldi Hemanja, who's the Chief Executive Officer of the Indonesian Infrastructure Fund, which is doing a fantastic job in Indonesia on this issue. We have Daniel Purba, who's the Senior Vice President of Investment and Strategy for Pertamina. We have Ramesh Subramanian, who's the Director General of the Southeast Asia Department of the Asian Development Bank and responsible for many of the extraordinarily important support programs in the region to address transition. And we hope that in a while we'll be able to get Pakwembi Saputra, who's the Assistant Minister of Macroeconomy and International Finance in the Republic of Indonesia, to be able to join us. But, oh, I've just been told. My apologies. Pak Saputra, I missed you. Thank you so much. Your job is to kick us off. But just before I get you going, just some introductory remarks. You've heard about the challenges. You know, there have been two very important reports issued in the last couple of months from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change on mitigation, and then previously on that, on adaptation. In Asia, in emerging markets globally, we are extraordinarily exposed to the impacts of climate change, as well as have a job shifting our economies to become low carbon and climate resilient. There is a huge job to be done. On the resilience side, it's physical, social and economic issues and development issues all packed into one. It's a complex issue. We need to transition our economies on a variety of fronts. We generally think of transition as just low carbon or low greenhouse gases, which is the first and most important and most urgent agenda. As the IPCC says in its report of a couple of weeks ago, last week, in fact, incredibly important report, we have to cut global emissions by 50% by 2030 to even have a reasonable chance of avoiding a catastrophic future for our children. So we have a very big job. And at the same time, not separately, not afterwards, but at the same time, we have to prepare our societies for increased storm surge and sea level rises, a big challenge for the waterfront in Jakarta, for example, and various other issues related to resilience. We have to transition our economies. This session today is about transition. It will mean capital support. If you look at infrastructure investment between now and 2030, Pak Rinaldi's area, some 70% of global investment in infrastructure will be in emerging markets, not in rich countries. Very important to note. I mean, in one hand, extraordinary opportunity, but the capital is not yet flowing adequately for a variety of reasons we'll ask our panelists about in a minute. We know we want more support from richer countries, capital cost relief and so on. I'll put aside the grant discussions that are underway in some places. We'll hear Ramesh talk a little bit about that, the Asian Development Bank. But we've had some success. While we know that the global capital investment required is some $90 trillion US over the next 30 years, an enormous figure, we do know also that the increased capital investment required is a lump of a few trillion, something between 5 and 10 trillion. So extra capital required is not as big a lump as it looks like at first. And we have a world awash in capital. When we give investors the chance to invest in green and transition and sustainable and social investments, they are clearly investing in the green and sustainable and social bond market, the area I work in, the area Don talked about. We now have some nearly $3 trillion US of bonds outstanding, when 10 years ago, we had 10 billion. I mean, that is extraordinary. And while we only have about 10% of those from emerging markets, in terms of the capital markets share of the global economy, emerging markets are also small. This is inextricably tied up with growing capital markets for the benefit of emerging markets. As well as we grow, we'll be able to ensure more transition. But we've got proof of concept. You give investors the chance to invest, and they are investing in extraordinary levels of appetite. We're still seeing oversubscription from emerging market as well as rich country bonds being the norm here. So that's the good news. We do need to be clear about what transition is. We'll have some discussion about that. But the ASEAN Taxonomy Board, made up of ASEAN central banks, has been doing work on that, has published a document at COP about what transition investment should be like. The Reserve Bank of India and MOF and UNDP in India are currently doing work on this question, and so on in other emerging markets, to be clarity about what to do. We do need to prioritize transition investments and support them, particularly from the richer countries of the world. But we also need to look at what we need to create. That $70 trillion of infrastructure, we've got to make sure that we actually build the right kind of infrastructure for the world. More railway lines in Bangkok, for example, in Mumbai, in Sao Paulo, and fewer freeways. So there are policy decisions involved in all this. Okay, to our panel. I'm going to now ask the man at the center of this, the man who is in incredibly important position in trying to navigate the shoals of transition, to lead us in a few words. Pak Supotra, Assistant Minister of Macroeconomy and International Finance, which is the key underlying theme here today. Please, sir, go ahead.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you, all colleagues, for inviting me to this very prestigious event. Actually, as you mentioned, that talking about the needs of the transition, it needs as well the huge investment, especially for the transitions. So, as part of the G20 meetings, actually we are discussing one of the priority agenda, the so-called sustainable finance, where in this case we are have been discussing on the transition finance framework, as well as the need to accessibility and affordability of the sustainable finance instrument. Talking about the needs of developing countries, firstly we must bring up the first, I think, report on the determination of the needs of developing country parties related to the implementing the convention and the Paris Agreement. In this, it elaborates qualitative and quantitative information of the needs of developing countries. And standing in this case, we see that the largest investment is needed to tackle this global challenge, as well as also to confirm, the cooperation and the collective actions among every countries, both advanced as well as the developing nations. And of course, when we talk about one of the important part of this transition, which is an energy, I would like to touch in this sector, that energy transitions, in one of the example, it is not an easy and will incur very huge costs, especially for developing countries. The transition to a green economy poses various challenges, such as a job distortion, including on energy stability, and raises the cost of living, especially in the early transition period. So measurable and planned transition management becomes very important in this case. Especially on the Indonesia's case, Indonesia, in partnership with the ADB, has launched the energy transition mechanism, which is expected to be able to encourage the transition in just and affordable way. The strategy is also expected, to measure the economic and social impacts, especially in areas that are economically dependent on coal. Decommissioning of these coal-fired power plants is one of the key actions as part of transition to a low-carbon economy, and the ETM, the Energy Transition Mechanism, could assist this process. So, along with the huge need of investment for the transition, each developing country may need some specific platform to channel the international, bilateral, or private financing to match their particular needs and specific characteristics to conduct transition, while also maintaining growth momentum at the same time. The so-called maybe government's policy or maybe country platforms should entail characteristics, including clarity of investment needs, the policy commitment, clarity on specific projects, and more predictable international financing. These properties, of course, will surely help the international communities to collaborate in joining efforts on the transition in developing countries. The coordination gaps or challenges, I think we have to identify between sectors as well as the various level of governments, because now in developing countries, especially in Indonesia, we are facing very challenging situation. How to, I think, also faced by another country as well, amidst this geopolitical crisis, become much more challenging in how to maintain this global challenge, especially related to the transition. So in this case, I think, Sean, beyond just mentioning huge amount of investment needed for transition, which is very clear, so international community can work together with all countries with developed and developing nations how to make a concrete efforts to actually implement the transition. So in this case, the collaboration to the specific country platform or maybe specific country-specific platform is very, very important in this case. I think I will stop here and get back to you.
Fantastic, thank you. Great remarks and very pointed comments you make about the coal decommissioning challenge we face. Let's come back to that question on everyone's minds. Can I turn to Mr. Arora, or Rita, if I may, to talk about the differences between Europe and Asia, but fundamentally, you are one of the largest investors in the world at Allianz. How do you see this issue?
Thank you. Thank you for that opportunity. And please do call me Ritu. That'll be nice. Thank you. I think Europe, it is the public, the government, our clients, and for us, it has become existential. We believe it is the license to operate and serve the public comes now with being sustainable as a business, being committed to sustainability. So it is very much a part of our being. It is a part of our DNA now. Asia, on the other hand, I believe, has other realities and is catching up and waking up to where the climate story, and Europe is leading that story, is headed towards. Clearly, Asia has deep dependence on coal across the different markets. But at the same time, I think now in Asia, in the last couple of years, I've noticed that ESG, climate commitment, sustainability is not one more compliance and becoming increasingly a part of investment decisions, a part of business decisions. So I believe while Europe is leading, Asia is catching up very significantly, and Asia will be the part of the world where we will see a lot of action, as was spoken in the last half an hour by all of you experts. It is clearly where capital needs to be attracted and is likely to flow from Europe as well as US. So I think Asia will be a key participant, though it started out late, it will be the strong one and a focus.
How do you see the different, Rita, you're freezing on us, I think. But how do you see the differences between Europe and ASEAN understandings of this issue? Are there differences, or do we have essentially a common approach?
There definitely are differences because the learning curve is different. In Europe, it is far progressed, and far progressed not just in terms of thinking, but also in terms of actionables, be it benchmarks, be it taxonomy. Taxonomies have been defined, adopted, etc. While at ASEAN, we are largely in the stage of developing these. And that is a key part, especially it is a key part even to attract capital in, to have as far as possible a standard, a taxonomy accepted and adopted and implemented. The second key difference is data, disclosures. I think Asia has a lot, most of the disclosure right now is voluntary and it is not as detailed and in-depth. And hence, that is a key component where Asia is still playing a catch-up game, and regulations and policy will play a key role there. And after which, I think, will be the sovereign, how strongly the governments will take a stance, make commitments, and then guide the action of the industry in that direction, and how much capital and support the governments will commit, which will help Asia catch up also. Because for every $3-4 that will come from overseas, or from developed countries, at least $1 will need to be invested locally. So I think in that respect, Asia needs to catch up on tangible, actionable items with Europe. I would list those three as important.
And just as a segue to Pak Rinaldi, who I'd like to bring in next, if the Indonesian infrastructure finance facility brings a whole lot of green and transition bonds to market, can we assume comfortably that Allianz is going to be very interested in having that conversation? Is that a safe bet?
Of course, we are very happy to have all these conversations. As you know, Allianz is deeply committed to sustainability.
Thank you. Just a little segue to Pak Rinaldi Hermanja, who of course is the CEO of the Indonesian Infrastructure Finance Fund, who has the job of creating real assets and real investments, or creating loan flows for them. Please go ahead, sir, your comments.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you also for inviting IIF into this event. So as you know, in Indonesia, our energy transition is captured in our what we call the National Energy Framework, whereas we are targeting the renewable mix is about 23% in 2025, and then about 31% in 2050. And I think, yes, we are a bit below that figure at the moment. I think we're still around the 9 to 10% figure. But if I can say that, like in our pipeline at the moment, 25% of the projects that we have been financing are all on renewable sectors, either from mini hydro, solar PV, biomass, to also wind farm. So all of those are already here in Indonesia. We have the opportunity to finance those projects. And yes, we are catching up in our financing on our infrastructure projects on the renewable area. So hopefully that can give you a little bit overview of what Indonesia, especially in the corporate side, has been doing in regard taking its part of this net zero transition. Thank you, Sean.
You have a huge list, from my understanding, of things to be done, infrastructure backlog in Indonesia at the moment, not to mention some enormous new projects such as the new capital on Kalimantan. So there's a lot to be done here. Can you give us a bit of a flavor of specific projects and investments that are coming through that we would be able to explain to international investors and parties as transition investments, just to make it real for our listeners?
Yes, I think from the government side also, through the KBPU or the public-private partnerships, there are a lot of projects from the renewables sectors that will be offered to the investors, either local or international. But aside from that, the private sectors are also building a lot of projects in Indonesia. So I think the pie is still very big here in Indonesia. Yeah. So the opportunity is so much. Thank you, Sean.
Okay, thank you very, very much. I'd like to now turn to Pak Daniel Purba from Pertamina. Now, Pertamina is, of course, Indonesia's national fossil fuel petroleum company, and is a high carbon company, clearly. But there's been a lot of discussions about how to transition Pertamina. And Daniel, you've been right at the center of those. Can you give us, our international listeners in particular, a bit of a flavor of what you're trying to do at Pertamina and where you've got to in terms of your forward commitments and the kinds of measures in place for transition now? Give us a bit of a flavor. You're on mute, I'm sorry, Daniel.
Oh, sorry, yes. That's always like that. Thank you, Sean, and thank you for the opportunity for us, Pertamina, to join on this panel. It's a great honor for us. I think, yeah, okay, if I allow to share some background, it is quite a big challenge, as you mentioned, as a oil and gas company. I mean, energy basically facing the transition era of the world right now towards the low carbon or renewable energy. So I think it is our commitment to ensure our sustainability company business, I mean, towards the energy transition. On the next slide, that we already set up some sort of focusing on in terms of a strategy of sustainability, dealing with the ESG, where everybody is having a very big interest right now on the ESG. So we already set up the sustainability policy as well as the sustainability committee. And on the other side, we have rated already just lately last year in September by Sustainalytics that we are in the middle race, 28.1 as our score on our ESG, which is number 5 on the oil and gas company in the world. So I think this is part of our journey to ensure the transition towards the energy transition right now. And in terms of energy mix, on the next slide, right now our new and renewable energy is only counted 1%. That we have already plotted in our pipeline in 2030. Our portfolio business in the new and renewable energy will become 17% in terms of our energy mix. And to reach that 17%, we already put in our capex around 14% on the low carbon gas and new renewable energy of our capex in the next 5 years. So it's around more than $10 billion we will spend on the gas and new and renewable energy to ensure our target of portfolio business of renewable energy in 17% by 2030. So this is how we commit as an energy company, where the international oil and gas company right now, they spend in their NRA is about 4%, while we are already plotted in our long-term business plan around 14%, slightly above $10 billion in the next 5 years. So it is a challenge for us to be on the financing side. Basically, on the next slide, in some project that we are going to do, we'll cover on the geothermal. It is our existing business basically, and also developing the hydrogen and also the EV battery and storage system. Green refinery, it is that already some of our refinery already can process the palm oil and used cooking oil, and other refinery will start as well towards 100,000 tons per annum in 2025. Bioenergy, we already start with the biodiesel, but we'll continue with the biogasoline and also biogas. Related to circular carbon economy, we also put some activity over there, not to mention the new renewable energy to build the solar panel, wind and hydro towards the next 6 years. What is the challenge to do this? I mean, there are two basically challenges in terms of technology. On the next slide, showing how do we mitigate that this challenge on technology and financing. I think on technology we have partnering with some company, with Japanese company and US-based company ExxonMobil, and also many other companies that we work together to develop this new and renewable energy. And in terms of financing, this is relevant to what we are discussing right now. 3 of our entity is now working toward the green bond. That's on the green hydrogen project on our geothermal project, and also on the sustainability link on the our Pertamina Power Indonesia, which is do a lot of renewable energy, and also on our gas listed company PGN is now working to finance some of the project on the transition financing. So this is how Pertamina as a energy company facing the transition of energy, and also how do we manage and grow our portfolio business in new and renewable energy by supporting through some financing instrument related to the new and renewable energy. Thank you, Sean. Back to you.
Daniel, these are it's a fantastic PowerPoint. Thank you. Very interesting. The challenge and what you're doing in terms of transitioning an oil company going forward, and the kind of investments you're making. You're not going to be an oil company in the future. You're going to be very much a mixed energy company. So it's very exciting. Do you see the global developments that are happening, for example, around the rapid shift to electric vehicles in China, as being a critical external driver for this change, or do you think this is slow? How fast does Pertamina think this change is going to happen, particularly in terms of demand for oil versus demand for your new electric vehicle battery factories and so on? What's your reading internally?
Yeah, I mean, for the electric vehicle, it requires a complex ecosystem to be developed. So every country, I think, will have its own journey towards the electric vehicle ecosystem development. So I think as a part of it, Pertamina also already put our footprint on this EV ecosystem. So we do a lot of research related to the EV battery storage and so forth, and some system B2C. So it is part of the journey that we already put our footprint on it. Where as a national-wise, Indonesia already set up this battery holding company consists of 4 state-owned enterprise. So this will grow and support to grow the ecosystem of the EV in Indonesia, where Pertamina, we will use our existing infrastructure to support this development.
Okay, fantastic. We'll come back to that because there's a massive story to be unpacked there, and I'm sure our listeners will be very keen to know more. But I'd like to turn at this point to, well, Ramesh from the Asian Development Bank, because of course we know that this transition that we're going through is not going to happen organically. It needs stoking, it needs support, and it needs concessional capital at the beginning in many areas to get us going. And of course, that's exactly what the Asian Development Bank has been doing. For our listeners, we've been blessed today to have 3 speakers from Indonesia, but this is, of course, an emerging market story. Indonesia is the example we're putting forward. It applies across Southeast Asia, which is Ramesh's area, but across all emerging markets. This same conversation we're having today is relevant and happening in India, in Africa, and Latin America. So do bear that in mind. But of course, Ramesh, you've been looking at how you might be able to support, how you are supporting transition across the region. Tell us more and your reflections, please.
Thank you so much, Sean, for moderating the panel, as well as to the organizers for setting it up, Dawn, the EU-Asia Business Council, and all the other partners. Great opportunity. Just a couple of things before I get into that, Sean, if it's okay with you. I just wanted to, reflecting on what Rita said, where does ASEAN stand in terms, in comparison with EU, the question that you posed to her. In fact, aspirationally, when we started working on the ACGF, the ASEAN Catalytic Green Facility, which Dr. Manirath mentioned, we were kind of, aspirationally asking, can ASEAN have a green deal like Europe? And we thought, why not? It's going to be complex, probably difficult. Some may say impossible, but we thought we needed to start somewhere. Mind you, this is before the pandemic. And clearly in the post-pandemic, in the pandemic and the post-pandemic context, with all the renewed focus and attention on green recovery and building back better, I think now certainly is an opportunity to work with the countries, whether or not we get a deal like Europe, but I think certainly we can build momentum. I also wanted to underscore what Pak Wempi mentioned. I think the numbers are huge. If you look at Asia and Pacific region as a whole, we came up with a few years ago, big numbers, $26 trillion needed to 2030. And ASEAN alone needs about $210 billion a year. This is overall climate adjusted infrastructure needs. And if you look at renewable energy alone, the region needs about $27, $28 billion a year. But we are getting only 1/10 of that. So clearly the unmet needs are huge. So in that context, on your question, Sean, what are we doing in ADB? I'll start with kind of the beginning. It's capacity building, technical assistance, which is going to be very critical as a development institution for us. Making sure that we don't go for a lowest common denominator type of approach. The countries that do need assistance need to be supported. Others who are in a better place, like Indonesia, for example, they've got strong institutions, but they also need capacity in certain areas. So coming up with an overall capacity building plan. As part of that, technical assistance is very important. And I would say that One thing that keeps me, many of my colleagues, and I think colleagues on this panel would agree, while these needs are large and clearly there is financing flow taking place, one thing that is not happening is the emergence of bankable projects. So you have big needs, $26 trillion, $1.7 trillion a year, but then where are the projects? So that's a concern. So when I mentioned technical assistance, it's also technical assistance and project development facilities, early stage development facilities, to develop a shelf of bankable projects in every country that we are working in. So that's been our aim. Related to this is creating enabling environment. Policy reforms are very, very critical. And in the green and climate finance area, particularly, starting with infrastructure reforms, policy, legal, regulatory, tariff reforms, we've been working on with many countries. And as we speak, particularly in the Philippines, we are putting together an innovative climate change policy program to help Philippines implement their NDC commitments. And as we know, in ASEAN, 8 countries, 8 out of 10 have gone for net zero by, I think, between 2050 to 2065. How is this going to happen? And can we create the enabling environment? So the policy reform instrument, which is actually basically corporate finance equivalent, where we give budget support to countries to leverage reforms. So that's been quite, I think, quite an important part of our support. A few other special initiatives, Sean, I'll just mention. One is what His Excellency Dr. Manirat mentioned, the ACGF, which in itself was born out of the one and only pure, totally, regional facility owned by the 10 ASEAN countries in ADB, which is the ASEAN Infrastructure Fund, set up in 2012. Out of that, ACGF was born a few years ago. And within that, we've been quite lucky, actually. A lot of partners, development partners, multilateral, bilateral institutions have come forward, committed close to $2 billion in terms of financing. So we are working on about 30 projects, all in ASEAN, to convert, make them bankable, and then go to these financing sources for money. As part of that, particularly one part you mentioned, the term concessional, which is going to be quite critical. So we've mobilized now about close to $660 million of fairly concessional funding. And this was launched at COP26 through a vehicle that we are calling Green Recovery Platform, part of the ACGF. The aim is to leverage the 660 to about $7 billion. So we are also calling it the 10X fund. The third point is on, we've set up, working with Temasek Holdings of Singapore and HSBC, a platform. Those two institutions have put in equity capital, a facility called Regeneration Platform. Essentially, the focus is on going to amber and red projects. If you imagine a traffic light system where private sector will not be going in, can we identify those marginally bankable or unbankable projects, make them bankable, go to these investors, and then leverage money from the financial ecosystem. So ADB would be providing upstream support, working with particularly Indonesia and Vietnam, which are the pilot countries to begin with, identify those bottlenecks, identify projects in that amber and red space, and take them to financial closure. Initially, $150 million of equity capital from Temasek and HSBC, and ADB providing debt financing, but we hope this can be replicated. And we have a large aspiration in terms of what we can do. Fourth is an innovative facility called Climate Innovation Development Facility. This is working with philanthropies. Goldman Sachs and Bloomberg Philanthropies come together with ADB. It's small, but it's very impactful. We hope it's $25 million. Looking at a couple of countries in the region. Again, this can be replicated with the aspirationally aim is to leverage it multiple times. And then we've set up a blue ocean hub. Pollution, as we know in the region, particularly ocean pollution in ASEAN, is very, very high. You've got 3 of the world's biggest polluters, ocean polluters, that is, in ASEAN. So the hub that we've created, located in Indonesia, would be preparing initially about close to $1 billion of projects. Again, the money is not going to come in unless the risks are addressed. So the challenge is to make them bankable, these projects. With the technical assistance and the other facilities I mentioned, we are quite optimistic. And then finally, the energy transition mechanism, which actually, all the credit goes to Don in terms of coming up with the concept. We are now giving it shape, focusing on Indonesia, Philippines, and Vietnam as the 3 initial pilot countries. Wempi mentioned this in his remarks. This is something particularly Indonesia's G20 presidency this year. We are hoping that we can work with Indonesia in achieving some concrete deliverables, but particularly in the form of setting up the first facility and fund, and also identifying a few coal-fired power plants for early retirement. And not just that, but I'll also mention here the transition needs to be just and affordable. So what comes in their place? And here, kind of circling back to the policy reforms point that I mentioned, we need to make sure that a coal plant that is closed is not replaced with another coal plant. So you need to make sure that a moratorium that sticks, that is binding, is in place, and that's what we are working towards in all the 3 countries that I mentioned. Not only that, but the transition process as well as the renewable solutions you bring in need to be just and affordable, and because otherwise you're going to face a lot of challenges. And then you have a whole host of ESG considerations that need to be brought in. Our goal is to be working with official development partners as well as private financial institutions and philanthropies. Goal is to set up an initial fund of $3 billion with a high degree of concessionality, and in parallel look at innovations if they emerge. Carbon pricing, for instance, going to be very hard. We have a carbon market development program at ADB. As part of that, there has been work done, but with or without that, certainly concessional money is quite critical to enable early closure of these selected coal plants. Let me pause there, Sean. I can address some of the other points later. Thank you.
That's quite a menu, Ramesh. It's fantastic. Thank you. I'd like to switch over to pick up the point you made around just and ask Daniel to talk about the just transition challenges for a minute. But can I ask Dr. Saputra Wempi, we're going to need you to say what you need for everyone else in a minute. I want to come back to you because I'm really conscious of the critical nature of the requirements, the ask, the demand of the international community on your plate. But Ritu, from your perspective, we know we've got a challenge with emerging market allocation in rich country investors. And I'm also going to be looking for you. How do we shift this needle, especially with your other international coalition members, the Net Zero Asset Owners Coalition? How do we increase the allocations? What do you need from Wempi and from Indonesian government to be able to make that happen? That's, I think, the asset question. But just before, let me just tease out this just transition. Daniel, you're in a very difficult situation. You have a huge workforce, like 1.2 million, I think, plus. I think the figures are showing that some 20 million people in Indonesia depend on the Pertamina ecosystem for their income. So if we're looking at transition, we are absolutely looking at how we transition a workforce in your case and ensure that we don't leave people behind as we shift, especially as we shift to high capex, low opex, but minimal human resource requirement investments, like a solar farm, for example, so on. How are you tackling and weaving into your thinking this question of just transition, which Ramesh has so effectively put on the table going forward? Just give us a flavor of how you're tackling it.
Yes, Sean, I mean, we fully understand that, in terms of a just transition, so it is in terms of economically, most of the new and renewable energy is not in place yet. And the things on the other side, we as energy company also expecting by our investor and also bondholders or asset management company that to show them how serious Pertamina manage its transition energy right now. So the way we do it, we start with our own consumption first. So some of our facility, this is also linked with our decarbonization. So it is for our internal use. We started first since we are operating from upstream refinery and also distribution. So all of our facility operation, we start change some part of our operation engine into the using the new and renewable energy. So utilizing the solar panel for the community in some of our housing complex, and even into our operationally engine using the power from a solar panel is now on the way. So it is we are not commercializing it into the people since the economy is not there yet, but we need to start on our footprint first. We know that this is a part of the journey of the energy in Indonesia, but maybe the stage is not like in developed country yet. But however, to understand, to operate this business and also get used with the technology and develop our human resources to handle this new and renewable energy, we have to start anyway. So that's how we manage. Of course, in terms of business itself, in terms of revenue and profit margin and so forth, is not quite sexy yet, I would say. But I would rather that this is as a part of the energy transition in Indonesia, but the stage is quite on the early stage. But however, we need to do it right now, since the technology will be developed. So by sometimes in the future, we are now already familiar with all of this kind of new and renewable energy. Sean?
Thank you. So in a sense, you're saying the shape of the future is certain. We've just got to figure out the speed of getting there, and we're learning by doing. Let's just get moving. Very interesting comments. Rita, I'd like to come to you before we go to Dr. Wempi and then Pak Rinaldi. Because at the end of the day, what we're talking about is mobilizing capital. Allianz, which is, I think, globally some 90% in fixed income, is, of course, one of the world's largest investors. And it's the heart of this really difficult question, which is capital resources are predominantly in rich countries. The need is in emerging markets going forward. Our asset allocations haven't shifted adequately. What do you need? And more to the point also, what do you see your peers and people like the Net Zero Asset Owners Coalition need from the transition and from the government side in emerging markets like Indonesia to do it? How do we end up, as a result, increasing the asset allocations as necessary? How's this really going to work?
Thank you. It's a big question, but I'll try to address it probably in parts. As you know, we represent one of the largest insurance companies in the world, and most of the capital we manage is fiduciary responsibility. And hence, the benchmarks don't really change when we talk of green financing or sustainability, and that makes it a bit tougher. Emerging market adds a layer of complication to that because these are unfamiliar markets and for many investors like ourselves. Allianz, I think, has a reasonably strong footprint in Asia, but that's not the same for all of my peers. What adds is to the complexity is inability to underwrite the risks there, especially now in a new and evolving sector and evolving technology, and hence the inability to underwrite those risks themselves. Data inefficiencies, unavailability, etc., adds to that complication, and hence it is easier to deploy capital in developed markets, known technologies, sectors that you are familiar with, understand. And here, particularly speaking from our own experience, what has been a game changer has been the involvement of development financial institutions, multilateral institutions. They bring in a big comfort layer and a big comfort in the entire structuring. And in fact, blended finance has been the answer for many such projects that we have underwritten in Asia. And so ADB and other such institutions have a big role to play. It takes that first, usually in such blended structures which have been successful, the first loss risk is taken away, either by the government or by the development financial institution, making it far more viable. And then when I speak for my insurance brethren, I speak for the pension funds, it becomes far more viable for companies like us to underwrite that risk. So I think more and more we'll see this partnership deepening. We've had some successes in different markets. But we will see this partnership deepening, and we'd like to work with ADBs and others.
You said something very important for Ramesh to pick up. You'd like to work with ADB, which is the essence of this, is a close collaboration.
This is not an introductory call, Sean. We are very much engaged with ADB across
but for our listeners, this is a bit of a new story. Ramesh, let's come back to that with you. You can talk about the collaboration. But Dr. Saputra, Wempi, if I might say, how does that fit with the nature of your ask? And given the context of the comments that have been made today by Rita and others, what's your ask? What do you want? And maybe use the example of the decommissioning investments that you started examining and looking at there. What do you need? What beyond what you've already heard today?
Thank you, Sean. Actually, developing countries are where the net zero projects are, and a country like Indonesia, I think these projects span multiple sectors, as you mentioned before, especially on the energy sector. So if the investment community has pledged to invest in green, then this is where the action is, in developing countries. So in our government in Indonesia has also done our part to make it easier to invest with clear policies. Of course, we need, so-called signaling to our pathways to the decarbonization and assess the financing needs. We also need the transition finance framework so that we can learn how to invite the potential investors in this case, and also to include the social inclusions, to teach, maybe to give the capacity building both to central government as well as the local government, because very many islands in Indonesia, so we need to increase the capacity of this local government. Indonesia's transition is not something planned in this distant future. Actually, it is already underway. So like a carbon pricing regulation was enacted, to ensure we can finally internalize the externality cost of the emission. We hope this could give a clean technology and competitive edge. So the carbon tax and carbon market regime for coal plants is scheduled to apply, hopefully in this year, on July 2022. So on top of making coal less attractive, we have been and also continue to work on making clean alternatives more attractive. So high upfront costs and cost of funding are being alleviated through tax incentives and feed-in tariff reforms for renewable energy projects. Financial institution risk aversion is being chipped away by a green taxonomy and ESG integrations. There is much improvement to be made, but the policies are there. Then these policies are designed to attract and leverage the private sector participations, in this case, to invest in green. So to leverage the private sector participation, how to invite them to invest in the green economy. So green transition is very important, especially for developing countries. And if supported, it would be a tremendous thing to achieve and may inspire replication as well.
Okay, that's a clear call. Thank you. Pak Rinaldi, you're running an organization which is in some ways, the perfect example of the blended finance facility going forward with the support of institutions. What are the lessons learned out of that in terms of growing this? And I'm acutely aware of Ramesh's comments about while capital is flowing, it is way, 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 way smaller than it needs to be to achieve the challenges. What are the lessons learned for others in doing this from your perspective?
Yeah, thank you, Sean. Especially when we're talking about, you mentioned that there is a huge capital available and the limited projects in countries, emerging markets, or let's say in this case Indonesia. But usually there's one thing that people forget, and this is what it is in the reality, is that projects in Indonesia, infrastructure projects, renewable projects, mainly are in rupiah. 75% of our projects in Indonesia are in rupiah. And this fund, this international fund, is in US dollar. Who then takes the risk of this hedging, this cross-currency swap or whatever structure? So that is one part of an issue. Yeah, there is a lot of projects here in Indonesia, of course. And then, of course, there's, as you mentioned, a lot of funding, available funds and all that. But it's all mainly in US dollars. So I think that's one thing that is on the ground, something that needs to be think about. I remember ADB is one of our shareholders also. I remember ADB at one time tried to issue an Indonesian bond, a rupiah bond. I think that's a good idea to issue a rupiah Indonesian bond, where then you don't have any currency exchange risk to finance this long-term project in Indonesia, in the infrastructure, in the renewable sector. So that's, I think, one. Usually only people say that there is this big fund and then there's this limited, but the interconnectivity, I think that's something that we need to take a look also. Thank you, Sean.
Thank you. Ramesh, I need to go back to you. You've kicked off a comment with you, a lot of thinking. And of course, Ritu has mentioned the nature of the collaboration. Tell us a little bit more about this, about how we're going to make investments in emerging markets way more attractive going forward. And does it all hinge on what you talked about in terms of bankability? Is that a huge barrier? Like, in other words, if we can make progress and then everything else will fall into place, or is it way more complicated than that?
Thank you, Sean. Well, it's definitely a huge barrier, because we do need to, and the you know, the nature of the barriers or the hurdles that you face obviously differ across sectors and differ across the types of projects. Like, you know, the amber and the red traffic light analogy that I used for region, the way we have categorized the projects for that, as well as for some of the other work that we are doing, clearly the low-hanging fruits you can probably, you know, look at, like many of the RE projects that we are seeing. Geothermal space, for instance, just to take that as one example, 10 years ago, we faced significant difficulties, both technical, legal, financial. But I think now we are on more comfortable grounds. Indonesia has made fantastic progress there. So it really depends across, depends on which sector that you're looking at. I'll just make a couple of points on, you know, totally agree with Ritu. Partnership, you know, leveraging going to be very critical. On ADB's side, we've got the overall institutional ambition to achieve a cumulative climate financing of $100 billion by 2030. But that's a target that used to be 80 billion, and President, in the context of COP26, has increased it to 100. So we are all, you know, committed to working internally within ADB, as well as much more importantly with partners outside, because we ourselves, we will be able to put in that money. But the question is not just the 100 billion that we will bring, because the needs are so much larger. Southeast Asia, for example, by so far we've done in the last 4 years, since 2019 when we started counting, we've done about $10 billion. And our aspiration is to reach for the region about, say, about $18-19 billion or so in the next 2 years. But the needs just for RE on an annual basis, the figure I gave earlier, is massively larger. So clearly, what is it that we can do? And there, what Ritu mentioned in terms of leveraging, working with others is going to be important. The ACGF, the entire platform is actually predicated on every project that goes through financing under ACGF has to meet at least 4 green criteria, and it also needs to meet 4 private sector capital, catalytic capital criteria. If they don't, then there'll be a disincentive. Pricing, sovereign pricing will start going up. It's a 2-step pricing that we are following. So as an incentive to, you know, bring in private capital. The second is taxonomy is going to be very critical. I think, again, Rita and then Pak Wempi mentioned, if I remember correctly, the ASEAN taxonomy for sustainable finance that's been developed clearly for harmonizing all our efforts is going to be quite critical. A couple of days ago at the ASEAN finance ministers meeting, the Indonesian Minister of Finance, as well as the Philippine Undersecretary of Finance and Excellency Dr. Maniro all mentioned this, talked about it. The need for more granularity in these in the taxonomy that has been developed by the Sustainable Finance Institute, which under the ASEAN Capital Market Forum, very good initiative, and that's something we will be working together with them. Finally, the last point that I wanted to touch on is what Pak Rinaldi mentioned. 500% agree with them. I think definitely local currency solutions are going to be quite critical. In fact, almost all the projects that we are looking at in the amber and the red space, they're all local currency projects. Like, for example, small scale waste to energy type of projects, or if you're looking at say cleaner inland waterways type of transport solutions that you're looking at. And of course, the ETM in some cases may be requiring also local currency solutions. So we are looking at this, the one issuance that we have achieved in Indonesia, but we have done many in the region, in the Asia and Pacific region. So clearly, either bond issuance and mobilizing funds through that, or cross-currency swap solutions do need to develop in parallel. Totally agree. I'll pause there, Sean.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ramesh. Look, we're in the final minutes of this event today, this fantastic event. We've got about 10 more minutes to go. So I'm going to ask all our panelists to focus their comments accordingly on where we go with this. We've had a few questions. One of the questions was, to what extent ASEAN companies are open to new businesses from other countries, someone from Octopus Energy. I'm going to say that's a very country-specific question, although Dr. Wimpy may want to comment on that. There are challenges, of course, with local markets and incumbent players and ensuring a just transition, such as in Pertamina's case, because we need to bring our people with us, which obviates against drastic revolution in our system, such as abandoning workforces and replacing with new. There are many challenges here. We've had a question about how we deal with energy poverty in the area. In Indonesia now, and in many countries, that's done of diesel. And diesel right now is expensive in a lunatic kind of fashion. Are the other options being pushed hard enough? Can we do more to promote distributed energy and so on? How critical a part of this is a question there that someone on the panel might want to pick up. There's also a question about nature-based solutions. And I'm not going to ask our panelists to go into that too much unless they want to, of course. But I'm going to say that in the taxonomy, take, for example, the Indonesian government's taxonomy of sustainable finance, there is scope for nature-based solutions. The question in all of these things is bankability. And that's the challenge of our nature-based solutions. How do we make sure there is actually a return to pay the debt and so on, as distinct from perhaps actions that governments might make from a policy or a government intervention or a government protection kind of way. But the answer from a green and sustainable bond market is yes, yes, yes. If you can make it work, if we can find some structure which ensures that it can fall into that class of bankable solutions, bankability, transition we've been speaking about today, green, resilience investments, for example, protecting Jakarta from storm surges in the context of the rising sea levels and the impact on the waterfront. All of these things can be included and examples have been part of the green and sustainable bond market. The trick is, how do we get them to be bankable in a way that will appeal to investors' risk yield requirements, because all investors are governed by regulatory arrangements around the fiduciary duties. They have to pay our pensions in 30 years' time. Otherwise, they are being negligent. So that's the challenge. That's the difficulty in all of this. Of course, transition is the main game because we've got to get our emissions down 50%. So, Daniel, I want to go to you first. You've given us, an impressive list of what Pertamina is doing, but. Is it enough? Probably not. How can we speed this up? What do you need to be able to speed up the transition investments? Shifting to 70% renewable energy by 2030 is fantastic, But from a climate scientist point of view, it probably needs to be 30% or 50% to do it. What do you need? And of course, how can the international community help you in this amazing journey you're on?
Yeah, that's one of the challenges, as I said, in terms of financing the project, that the bankability is still difficult. But not all of it. Some of it is bankable. I mean, for example, simply geothermal, where our subsidiary Pertamina Geothermal Energy is number 3 in the world. So this is what we will be focusing on, to develop our renewable energy by doubling our geothermal capacity in 2026. So that's as a first part. Of course, we need to execute, do the FID on the project that bankable and feasible. That's what we are doing. Second, I think the market is big. I guess not only in Asia, in ASEAN, but all over the country. So I think in terms of exploring or exploiting our natural base, I think right now we can start with a lot of opportunity that we are working right now, but it's not as a start, not depend on the domestic market, but we engage, or we use international market as a first step, while waiting the updating on technology that will allow cheaper costs to producing it. But of course, as you mentioned, what do we need? I think we need some sort of collaboration between developing country and developed country to work together with to cooperate to develop this. I think it will take some stages in some developing country as a just transition, but I think to start with and developing the technology, I think then they can start their footprint on this new renewable energy on the business, especially for Pertamina as an energy company. So I think right now, not all of it is not economic, but some part of it is not economic yet. For that component, I mean, for that business, of course, we use it for our internal energy first before we commercializing it into the market. So yeah, that's Sean, I think, that I can share. You're on mute. Yeah.
Like everyone's the most common term in the English language, at least you're on mute. Pak Rinaldi, from the Indonesia Infrastructure Fund's perspective, again, you've got a major challenge. What are the challenges and the solutions you want to leave our audience with as a parting comment?
Well, I believe Indonesia is already on the right track in regard for its energy transition. Yeah, we have our targets, we have our plan in place. One thing that I think I don't think there is a standard recipe for each and every country. So each and every country, I think, have its uniqueness, has its own way of achieving it. So I think with that and with our strategy, I think this is possible. Yeah. So very much I think that this energy transition, the move towards a higher mix of renewables are going to be achieved, but each country with its own strategy. Probably that's maybe my closing remark. Thank you, Sean.
Good comments. Thank you so much. So much to be done. We look forward to a lot of green bonds for infrastructure fund going forward, at least I do from my perspective. Ritu, from your perspective, and I was reminded while you were speaking earlier about a report the Australian government put out, of all governments, in November when they published their net zero by 2050 plan, which was a discussion about why in the annexures to that report, they talked about how global capital markets are shifting toward being green and sustainable. And in fact, in Europe, in November, 44% of all corporate bonds were ESG or green or sustainable. This was an extraordinary milestone. Hi, Mark. The Australian government, in their report, which is their rationalisation of net zero, said that if Australia didn't adopt the net zero plan, an ambitious one, it risked losing access to preferential capital markets, and its sovereign borrowing costs would go up 100 to 300 basis points. It's a pretty hefty increase in sovereign borrowing costs. So that's one of the, and let's call it, relatively climate change skeptical government comment about where capital markets are going. You're at the centre of that. You're at the centre of that. And I've been on so many working groups of Allianz staff around the world who've been wonderfully vocal on the importance of tackling the forward risks of not tackling the issue. So how optimistic are you that we're going to meet Ramesh's comments about the scale of capital required? And how do we turbocharge this from sitting around the table today, this transition that we need?
Sure, happy to address that. And maybe I should put in context, and like I said, I speak for the other insurance pension funds that have come together in Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance, for example, which is over $7 trillion committed to doing things in the sustainable way. Now, there are two aspects to this capital deployment. One is, of course, green investment, sustainable investment, which is still a very small portion of the capital market flow. The other part is all other investments. Now, sustainability has become such a part of the ecosystem, a part of existence, that any investment that we make, the criteria may not be to support a transition, but any investment we make, it is a matrix to see how sustainable the business of that enterprise, company, institution is. What are their commitments? Are they signatories to PRI? What is the country doing? So it has become such an integral part of every capital deployment decision-making that for sure countries and businesses that are not on this path will find it increasingly difficult and will feel suffocated for capital. It need not be for transition. They might be in completely different business altogether. And for sustainable and transition finance, of course, it goes without saying that countries, policies, taxonomy will all have to come together to support the business in attracting the capital. So it is definitely a reality. We in Allianz, for example, would not be able to fund even $1 to a business which is not on this path. It may not be there yet, but it has to have a sustainable footprint or a path to getting sustainable.
That is an amazing comment, an amazing statement. Essentially a license to operate kind of comment. So that's, as you mentioned earlier. Ramesh, final reflections, and then we'll go to Wempi for the last word.
I'd say partnerships going to matter a lot, Sean. And in addition to that, bankability or partnership to ensure bankability, partnership to mobilize the financing needed. Those are the two things. So I will say we can work smarter, we can work harder, but we need to work together given the needs.
Beautiful. Wempi, you're in the hot seat. You're in the middle of the government trying to manage this transition. Reflections from today and a last chance to thump the table and tell us what you need.
Actually, I also have my friends here, Pak Daniel Purba and Pak Renaldi Sean, under state-owned enterprises. So we have also friends in ADB as well. 2 lines from me, Sean. First, we need funding to build the new renewable energy in response to the growing demand. Thus, this is a double investment actually. Requires that we retire the more polluted one and build the new cleaner one. The second, we surely need to build a coalition from a political economy perspective. This is not an easy task, but this is, I think we need the capacity building from advanced countries, how to convince those politicians when we come up with these very incredible proposals. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you. Don, my friend, my mentor, and of course, the leader of us today, the last word.
Thank you. let me just start with that. It won't be my last word, but I just want to say thank you. When we decided to kick off, the three groups got together and to collaborate on this initiative for the year, the Emerging Market Transition Investment Initiative. We wanted to start with a panel that represented a diverse perspective. And this could not have been better. I mean, thank you, Sean, for being a fantastic, had never had a doubt that you'd be the superstar moderator, but this superstar panel that came together, we think about the diverse perspectives that are represented in this panel. National government, Ministry of Finance, private investor, multilateral bank, a big issuer that is making a transition in the sector that is critical to the transition play, and then an infrastructure finance institution. I mean, these are really among the most important diverse perspectives that need to come together. And I think what I heard today, and I'm hoping that the audience who was participating comes away with a number of important things to take away. One is that this is not, we're not talking about 2030 getting started. This is already underway, number one. Number two, the opportunity, but also the challenge is around radical collaboration. It takes all of these perspectives, and it takes people consistently doing what you were doing. How can we help? What do you need? Listening and then coming up with solutions, the kind of solutions that were discussed today. But it takes all of these parties to be willing to radically collaborate. The old model doesn't work. We have to be willing to move, and we have to be willing to move quickly. So the other thing that I think came through today was discussion around how do we scale up, whether that's domestic capital market solutions or whether we're talking about national scale platforms, making blended finance work, not just on a project by project basis, but from a fund or a platform perspective. I mean, all these things are critical. And what didn't come up today, but I would leave as an optimistic point, because we're talking here from the perspective that wasn't represented here today, is the perspective of the real economy. Last week I was in Cambodia, and I'm frequently somewhere else in the region. And I would say a few years ago, when you went to any country in our region, you would hear people talk about the transition as an environment minister problem, or a energy minister problem. But today, with companies in every industry needing to green their supply chains in order to remain competitive. If you want to get the next data center, they want green energy. If you want to get the international company, you want to be part of an international company's supply chain, you need green energy to qualify. Getting ready to deal with the carbon border market adjustment that may get put into Europe's trading system in the next few years. To be competitive, we need to make a transition if we're manufacturing something in Asia. And so I think those sectors of the economy are going to be demanding these solutions and driving all the rest of us, whether we're financing things, we're building infrastructure to move quicker. So I came away from today thinking I love the seeing this panel mainly agreeing and mainly working together on something that's already underway. Let me just say in wrapping up, in addition to thank you, all of you, and thanks to His Excellency, Dr. Alampour Manaroth, for opening with a keynote, which I think laid a good foundation for this discussion, is that if we really want people to reach out after this discussion today, the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance, the asset owners on this call, emerging market, developing market institutions and asset owners, please, we really would like to have more participation from the emerging developing markets in the Alliance. And so check the chat box. This is a recorded presentation. It'll be distributed in links. Please share it. Share it with others so that there's others who can benefit from this kind of knowledge about the particular issues and opportunities in the emerging markets. SDIP, EU-ABC, the EU-ASEAN Business Council, the Climate Bonds Initiative, there'll also be information in the chat box. Please reach out for further information on that. I think this was a great start to a year-long initiative, and I want to thank again all our panelists and Sean for doing a tremendous job. Best wishes to everybody.
Remember, everyone, huge challenge. The capital is there, the solutions are there, but there's a lot to be done. We want to create a future for our children. Please, good luck.
Urgency, good luck.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Donald. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Ronald.
Bye. Thank you.